All right, howdy everyone. So before I get too far ahead of myself again, let me back up a moment and kind of talk about where I've been and where I'm going. So again, the horizontal is obviously now it's bolted to the fuselage. I've got the appropriate bolts in the appropriate places with the appropriate shims and spacers. I've got the angle of incidence set correctly. I've got the elevators mounted and I've got them clamped in trail with the horizontal stabilizers. So this would represent straight and level flight. I've also got, let me squeeze in here. I've now got the appropriate bolt and washers in here for this pivot point, and I've got the push rod is now in place. Now I didn't cover the construction of the push rod because it's the same general method as the long push rods that are inside of the wings. It's the same concept as those, so I didn't go over it again. I just went ahead and made it, and now it's installed, and it's got the appropriate washers in here for spacing. So this is all bolted in and ready to rock and roll. The first thing that I did before I connected the push rod was to let the elevators move freely. And again, if you've got your pivot points in here adjusted correctly, or I should say the hinges, if you got your hinges adjusted correctly, and you've got this pivot aligned correctly and your horns are incorrect, these should be on the same plane as one another, and they should be able to move together, bolted together here and down where the push rod is connected. They should be able to move freely with no binding. So make sure you have all of that in place and everything is tight. All of these pivots are supposed to pivot around either a bearing or the rod end bearing. They should not be pivoting around the bolts. So the bolt should rotate with the control surface. It should not sit freely and the horns rotate around the bolt. I hope that makes sense. You want to actually make sure that everything is clamped tight. Everything is bolted down tight. So only the bearings are doing the pivoting. My battery is about to die, so let me stop here and put this on charge, and then I'll come back. Howdy, everyone. All right, so I got a little bit of charge in this camera. Let me go over this again real quick. So I've got everything set up real world back here, and I've got the, you can see the push tube is now in place, and like I said, I've got everything shimmed and spaced correctly, the bearing, the ball end deal here is also spaced correctly and shimmed with the washers the way it needs to be. I had the elevators with all of that hooked up. I moved the elevators through their full travel up and down, no binding, no weird noises. It's super smooth. It's really nice. You want to be absolutely sure that you've got everything perfect back here because this is all part of your overall rigging and it's going to affect how the airplane flies. So this is where you really want to pay close attention to detail with everything. So again, horizontal stabilizer bolted in place. Everything is perfect. I've got my hinge points adjusted on both elevators. And I've got the bearing, of course, was made when the horizontal was made. And I've got the push rod tube in. Everything is true, plumb, square, however you want to look at it. Free to move. So when you look at chapter 15, there's a table that tells you the maximum allowable control surface deflection for all your control surfaces. For the elevators, it is a maximum deflection of 30 degrees up and a maximum deflection of 25 degrees down. Now I got my 25 degrees down, no problem, but I was not able to get my full 30 degrees up. And the reason is this. This control horn happens to be a little bit further aft than this control horn down here at the tips. They line up here, but they're just a little bit off this way, if that makes sense. One's a little bit further back than the other, which is fine. But because of that, when I go up elevator, this right side horn hits this cutout before this left horn does. So to alleviate that, I cut a little bit of a notch here on the deck plate. So that allowed this horn to come into the notch, and now this horn is hitting this part of the deck plate right here. So I was able to get a little bit more up elevator, but even with this notch cut out, with this horn coming all the way over and bumping up against this deck plate, I still do not get my full 30 degrees. I'm only getting about 28, 28.5. However, I could, in theory, notch a notch here to bring this horn back further, but then of course I'd have to make this notch even bigger. I'd have to notch it deeper this way aft to get both those horns to pull back further, which would give me more up elevator. I am not willing to do that because you can see that this is getting a little thin here. If I were to bring this back even further, it would be even more thin. There is a piece of aluminum angle that goes here that acts as the actual stop for these horns. You don't rely on this piece of deck plate as your stop. There's an aluminum angle that mounts here for the stop. And you need some material in here because it does get riveted to the deck plate. Ultimately, the strength comes from two bolts that go through that angle and through your longerons and gets nuts on the bottom side. But there are a couple of rivets in here, and I don't want to start cutting back this leg of that angle. I don't want to shorten that leg of the angle just to get these horns to throw further. So this is all I'm going to do. When I put my aluminum piece in here, I'll notch it just like I notched this, but that's it. I want some decent material back here to bolt that to. So I don't think I'm going to do anything else with this. I'm just going to live with the fact that I've got 28 and a half degrees of up elevator instead of the full 30. All right, so after all that's been checked and verified, I put the elevators back in neutral position with the blocks of wood and the C-clamps. So now these are in trail, like I said, with the horizontal. The push rod, or the push-pull tube, is in place. And I've got the bell crank in place up front. So here's the bell crank. Where are you, bell crank? There he is. So I got the bell crank in position, and the instructions say that if you put a bolt through the bottom end of the bell crank, so down here there's a bolt in the bell crank. There's a hole here to get a socket into so you can tighten that bolt. However, you could use the hole. They say to put a socket in there, but what I did, I just used a longer bolt, and I've got the head of the bolt sticking really close to the hole. If you center that bolt on this hole, that's basically neutral position for the bell crank, pretty much vertical. So I don't know how well this will show up, but you can see, if you look at that bolt fore and aft, it's pretty much centered in the hole. So with that centered, and with the elevators pinned in the neutral position with the C-clamps and the wood blocks, you adjust the length of your push-pull tube. Couple of things. Each ball end needs to be no more than, you have to have at least half of the threads in your fitting on both sides. You have to have at least half the threads threaded. So what I had done, I had put the jam nut roughly halfway on the shank of the ball end, the swivel end. Put the jam nut about halfway on the threads, and then I threaded the ball end up to that jam nut. I did that at both ends. So now I know at that point I could only thread it in further. I cannot make it any longer because I've already set it at the halfway point, which was fine because the rod ended up being too long anyway, and I had to go ahead and thread both ends inward to get that bolt to be centered in that hole. So that worked out just fine. So I have more than half the threads into the fitting. One more thing. Again, this goes back to what I had talked about with doing some of the aileron rigging in the wing. This ball end here, you can see how it is vertical, or hopefully you can see how it's vertical. It's not swiveled one way or the other. You don't want to preload the swivel jammed up against one way or the other. You want that ball end nice and perpendicular. Once you get that set, you can tighten up the jam nut. Then without moving this, without allowing it to swivel so that it's locked up against one or the other horn, you do the same thing with the front swivel. You want to set that jam nut with the ball end perpendicular. You don't want your ball end here to be swiveled up against, potentially up against your bell crank. It doesn't actually hit, but what I'm saying is you don't want this to be preloaded one way or the other like this. And then the other end the same way. If it gets preloaded one way or the other, now your push-pull tube has no travel, and that can induce binding. So when you have your length set, when you go to tighten these jam nuts, just make sure that this ball end is nice and perpendicular. You've got plenty of space for it to swivel. Just make sure it's straight up and down. It's centered between your bell crank and it's straight up and down. And without moving this, you want to verify that the other end is the same way, that it's perpendicular, straight up and down, and you're not going to have any binding. And like I said, I can't stress it enough. This is really critical stuff here, especially with your elevator setup. The relationship between this elevator to this elevator. And then, of course, the elevators in relation to your pivot bearing. You can't have any binding. And then you've got the horns related to each other and how they relate to the through bolt down here for the pivot of the push-pull tube. You also want to be mindful when you set your hinge gaps or your hinge lengths, the ball ends that move the elevator in this fashion. You want to have them set such that when you get your hopefully 30 degrees up and full 25 degrees down, that the elevator is not bottoming on the skin edge here. You don't want these so close, so tight that when you move your elevator, it ends up hitting the skin anywhere along the length, both on top and on bottom. And of course, that goes for both elevators. And then you also want those adjusted so that you've got a fairly even gap across this whole length. You don't want a large gap at this end and no gap at that end. It's a lot of fooling around. It's a lot of setup. The majority of this should have already been done when you built the horizontal and fitted the elevator to it. But again, it's very critical because this is all part of the rigging and all of this is going to affect how your airplane flies. Okay, enough of that. Let me move on to some new things and I'll get back to you.